the way that knowledge is kind of paradigmatically represented these days is as an object and as something which is fixed and permanent. That's something I've spoken about elsewhere. And as I've already said, a lot of the metaphors that we use in our language about objects are either drawn from that or reinforce that or part of that sense. So we talk about clear language, and we talk about transparency, and we talk about hard facts and so on. I think it's interesting to compare that to a little bit I've been reading about in terms of how knowledge was communicated before the existence of the book. Because the book, in a sense, is the kind of the ultimate object, which is something I'll maybe talk about again. Before the existence of the book, when knowledge was confined to either very limited edition scriptures or was communicated within an oral tradition, then the methods of knowledge transfer, the skills associated with that knowledge transfer, and the way that knowledge transfer was talked about and the way those skills were articulated was completely different, I think. When knowledge transfer, when knowledge exists not within the fixed form of a book, but within an oral form, then it isn't an object in quite the same way. If it's a substance at all, metaphorically speaking, it certainly isn't a hard substance. It doesn't have permanence, it doesn't have clearly bounded edges. It's much more like it is much more like a substance of liquid, for example. And I think it's quite interesting that in the study of rhetoric in medieval times and in ancient Rome, I think, when rhetoric was being talked about, one of the features that one would work on, or that one would value in an effective speaker, was what they call ductus. Ductus, I think, means something like flow. So we have it in modern speech within the etymology of words like conduct, in which some electricity, for example, is flows, metaphorically speaking, or we still do say something a ductile if they're capable of flowing. But for the ductus in medieval rhetoric was the flow of speech, and that might be the rhythms that the speech makes. It might be the flow of the sounds as they move through the speech. Some sounds being much more sort of punctive. Punctive, is that a word? Yeah, well, much more punctate, and other sounds being much more smooth, for want of a better word. But particularly, ductus was applied to the flow of ideas within speech. So the good rhetorician would be one who could control the flow of ideas within that rhetoric, such that the listener experienced that flow and was emotionally and intellectually guided through the ideas, with high points and low points and swirling eddies of ideas, returning and passing through and so on. So you would be absorbed and buoyed along by those ideas. It's a very different way of understanding what's going on in terms of the construction of knowledge, and how we think about what knowledge is, and how we talk about what knowledge is. Rhetoric and allied oral forms tend to use much more liquid-based, non-solid metaphors. They tend not to configure knowledge as an object, because the means of its conveyance is not an object, and tend to assume that the receipt of that communication is similarly the receipt of a washing over of some kind of conductive substance, not the possession of a non-conductive